I was sitting in a quiet, sun-drenched cafe last week when I noticed a woman at the corner table. She had everything laid out perfectly. A leather-bound journal, a single green tea, and a stack of books on stoicism. For a moment, she looked like the literal embodiment of discipline, calm, focused, and entirely disconnected from the digital world. But then, I watched her spend the next 20 minutes meticulously adjusting her tripod, wiping a smudge off her camera lens, and checking the lighting on her face. She was filming a 30 days offline vlog. There was this strange, frantic energy behind her movements. Every time she sat back down to look peaceful for the lens, her eyes would immediately dart back to the screen to check the frame. She wasn't actually reading the books or writing in the journal. She was documenting the aesthetic of being the kind of person who reads and writes. It was a flawless performance of productivity, yet she seemed more tethered to her phone than anyone else in the room. That scene stayed with me because it perfectly captures the paradox we're all living in. We've reached a point where the appearance of a balanced life has become more valuable than the balance itself. We call it productivity, but it's often just horizontal growth checking boxes and racking up views, while the actual vertical integration of our mind, body, and soul stays completely stagnant. It made me wonder, why are we so obsessed with performing discipline for an audience while we feel increasingly empty when the camera's off? We've mastered the art of public listening and curated routines, but in the process, we've lost the emotional intelligence to actually sit with ourselves. We are living in the illusion of productivity, and the cost of that performance is a deep, quiet disconnection from our own reality.
Wow. That story, I mean, that really just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? That contrast between the perfectly staged discipline and then the frantic reality behind the camera.
It felt so real. And it immediately gets us to the core of what we're looking at today, this illusion of productivity and the quiet disconnection that seems to come with it.
Exactly. And I think that's the mission for this deep dive, right? To unpack that. Because our sources, they argue that what you saw isn't just, a quirky personal habit.
It's a symptom of something much bigger.
It's the product of these deep systemic shifts in society that they've systematically replaced our internal anchors with these really fragile external ways of measuring our worth.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Our sources today cover everything from sociology to legal philosophy. So where do we start?
I think we have to trace it. We'll start at the psychological level with the individual and then move through the structural changes that causes, how it affects our identity. And then we can finish by looking at the really profound political and institutional impacts.
Especially on our ability to have a shared civic life.
Exactly. We really need to understand the full scope of this performance culture and what it's actually costing us.
All right, so let's start with the psychological fallout. I mean, my mind immediately goes from that cafe scene, this whole thing of documenting the aesthetic of discipline, to the broader sociological impact, this idea of performative productivity.
Right.
How does that connect to what our sources, specifically someone like Christopher Lasch, say about the culture of narcissism, especially in our modern professional lives?
Well, what's so critical here is that the sources give us a much more refined definition of narcissism. It's not the simple, self-love or vanity we usually think of.
It's not just someone who likes looking in the mirror.
Not at all. They argue that this modern pathological form of narcissism is actually perfectly suited to our digital world. The core idea is that it isn't about having too much self-love. It's about having no genuine self-love at all.
Okay, so if it's not self-love, what is it? What's at the root of it?
It's rooted in what the sources call an unbearable internal void. Pathological narcissism, in this sense, isn't a sign of strength. It's an absolutely insatiable need for external validation from other people.
I mean, the sources describe it as the self is a prison. That's a powerful phrase.
It is. It means the person is just relentlessly, almost frantically driven to get attention and feedback because they don't have that inner stability to feel real when they're alone. They need other people to constantly tell them they exist, that they have worth.
Hurt to a woman in the cafe. She couldn't just be disciplined. She needed the camera to prove it. And the act of proving it completely destroyed the thing itself.
That's it in a nutshell. And that makes the whole cultural focus on the self-improvement, self-worth seem less like empowerment and more like a desperate, exhausting addiction.
And the tragedy is that our society is now basically built to feed that addiction on a massive scale.
Absolutely. We're not talking about isolated cases anymore. The sources call it industrial-scale narcissism. Our technology, our platforms, our modern professional structures, they are actively producing and rewarding these exact traits.
And the currency is what? likes, views.
It's the quantifiable feedback. It's the plastic likes, as one source puts it, on a manufactured, highly curated photo. The whole system incentivizes the performance because the performance generates engagement, and engagement is the real product.
Which brings us back to that central paradox. We talk constantly about self-achievement, self-improvement, this extreme focus on the individual. But the behavior that gets rewarded by social media is actually rooted in this desperate craving for attention that comes from that internal void.
That's the loop. The focus on the self is supposed to create this strong, autonomous person. That's the ideal of vertical growth, right?
Right.
But because the metrics are all external and horizontal, all the energy goes into perfecting the performance.
So the more self-centered you become online, the more dependent you actually are on everyone else.
Precisely. You're constantly looking outside yourself for the structure you're missing inside.
And we even see this play out in the realm of apparent morality, this idea that these narcissistic needs can be disguised as virtue.
Yes, the communal narcissist archetype. This is where the analysis gets really interesting. It shows how this performance ethic can warp even acts that are supposed to be selfless.
Right. But let me push back on that for a second. Let's say a communal narcissist who's only driven by public approval does something good. They organize a huge charity drive or hand out meals at a soup kitchen. The good deed still happens, right? The community still benefits. So why do the sources see the motive as the real problem?
That's a really critical question. And it's true, on a superficial level, the soup is handed out. But the sources focus on the destructive impact of that motive on two levels. First, on the person themselves, and second, on those closest to them. For the narcissist, the act is just a transaction. It's a way to get external supply, not a genuine expression of care. And the problem is that performance just digs the trench deeper between their public virtue and their private reality. The real cost, the true damage, becomes visible when the act is dropped.
The moment they're off stage.
Exactly. The sources give this really chilling analysis of how the communal narcissist, after performing these saintly deeds in public, is often just incredibly callous, dismissive, even cruel to their own family.
To the people who don't provide that public validation.
Right. Their closest relationships become the victims of all the energy they spend maintaining that public facade. It proves that the internal change, that vertical integration we talked about, it never happened. The soup kitchen wasn't about the community. It was about getting that rock star status to keep the internal prison walls from closing in.
Which, I mean, that brings us right back to the erosion of standards.
Yeah.
If the performance is what gets rewarded, then actual competence, actual merit becomes secondary.
That's the bottom line. If we're rewarding the performance of success, the horizontal growth, the checking of boxes, the pretty documentation of work over the actual deep work, then we are fundamentally undermining meritocracy.
The effort shifts. Why spend years mastering a skill when you can spend a few hours mastering how to look like you mastered it and get a bigger, faster reward?
The effort goes into branding the stack of books, not reading the book. And in so many fields now, the ability to maintain a successful personal brand has become the metric of merit, regardless of the integrity of your actual output.
So the system ends up marginalizing the quiet, deep worker who just refuses to play the game, even if their contribution is profound.
It's a system that's been optimized for surface area, not for depth. And that's the key sociological impact. We've structurally incentivized superficiality, which sets the stage for the next part of our discussion, the actual structural disintegration of identity itself.
Right, because this performance isn't just exhausting. It reveals this deep trade-off we're all making. We've structurally shifted the anchors of our identity from internal things like family or duty to these external, constantly changing metrics.
Which takes us directly to that really pertinent anecdote from the sources about the character Clara. It's just a perfect illustration of this structural disconnection.
Yeah, the story of Clara is presented as a kind of modern tragedy. A life that looks perfect from the outside, but is completely unmoored.
It's a powerful case study in what sociologists call structural anomie. It shows the active choices people make when they elevate these external validation metrics above everything else.
So tell us a bit more about her, the environment she built for herself, and the anchors she decided to cut loose.
Well, Claire lives in this high-rise apartment, and everything is meticulously organized to fit this modern minimalist brand. Everything is visually flawless, but the sources stress this hollowness just beneath the surface. Her life is designed to be instantly photographable.
An Instagram feed made real.
Basically. And she consciously starts dismantling the messy, non-photogenic parts of her life. The first major anchor she cuts is her family. her history. She stops visiting her parents in the countryside. And the reason she gives is that their home didn't fit her brand.
That is just chillingly pragmatic. The actual family connection is sacrificed because it introduces visual clutter into her curated identity.
That's it, exactly. The house was messy. It contained decades of non-curated history. It didn't provide the visual consistency her brand needed. And the second thing, which is maybe even more telling, is she said she found the conversation with her family draining.
Why draining?
Because they were messy, unpredictable, they weren't linear, and most importantly, they lacked the instant, quantifiable reward structure of her digital life. A difficult conversation with your mom might be vertically integrating, but it doesn't get you a single like or share.
So family, tradition, history, all the slow, difficult, foundational stuff is just seen as a liability because it doesn't offer an immediate metricized return.
That's the calculation. And this shift is what structural anomie is. The individual makes a deliberate trade. They move away from these deep vertical anchors, duty, history, community, and toward an existence that's fueled almost entirely by horizontal social media validation.
And the result is they end up just floating.
Floating in this vast, shallow sea of digital approval, as the sources put it. You dissolve the traditional anchors of family and civic institutions to stay afloat. But
You're completely unrooted. And the sheer amount of energy it takes to keep floating, to maintain that performance, that's what leads to the calculation she makes in her professional life too, right? This metricized value system.
That's the visual ROI calculation. The sources describe a situation where Clara was asked to join this small but important local civic project, and she declined. The reason she gave was explicit. There was no visual ROI.
Return on investment.
Right. The work was crucial for the community, but it was just hours of boring meetings and administrative tasks. There was no way to make it look aesthetic or dramatic for her grid.
So the actual benefit to the community was irrelevant compared to the fact that it couldn't generate a good post.
Exactly. If the action couldn't be framed as a successful, virtuous performance, if it couldn't generate digital currency, it was worthless. That's structural anomie in action. The only remaining norm becomes optimized for visibility. She's connected to thousands of followers, but she's structurally rooted in absolutely nothing that lasts.
And this shift from, solid, bounded groups to these flexible, shallow networks.
Yeah.
This is something sociologists have been tracking for a while now.
Oh, yeah, for decades. This is where the concept of networked individualism comes in, from the sociologist Barry Wellman. It's the structural explanation for this new reality. Society has shifted from being organized around these tight-knit groups, the extended family, the local church, the union hall, to these flexible, dispersed networks.
Where each person is basically the CEO of their own social world.
You're the center of your own social universe. You have these weak ties across multiple specialized networks. You get emotional support from one group, professional advice from another, political commentary from a third. The benefit is flexibility, but the consequence is that the entire burden of making sense of it all, of creating a coherent self, falls on you.
That sounds incredibly draining.
Yeah?
I mean, if you're pulling from 40 different networks and each one has slightly different rules, you have to maintain 40 partial versions of yourself. How do you keep a coherent core, a stable vertical self?
You don't. Or it becomes incredibly difficult. That's the authenticity challenge that Sherry Turkle talks about. Our online lives aren't separate anymore. They're totally integrated with our real lives. So this demands a new and exhausting skill. The continuous management of multiple partial identities. We're constantly code switching.
So the woman in the cafe, wiping the smudge off her lens, that's a micromanagement of her identity for one of her networks. It almost sounds like the structure itself demands this kind of narcissistic behavior.
It really does, because the structure rewards optimal performance management. A stable vertical self requires downtime, reflection, integration, all the things you can't film for a grid. But navigating dozens of horizontal networks requires constant monitoring and adjustment, which actively works against that integration.
So you're just juggling all the time, constantly checking the lighting and adjusting the tripod for every single interaction.
We have structurally optimized for breadth for horizontal reach at the expense of depth, of vertical stability.
And yet, despite all these powerful forces, the sources really emphasize that the fundamental human need for authentic, deep connection that doesn't go away.
That's the painful friction point. The structure has been optimized for performance, but our psyches are still optimized for depth and real presence. We've spent our resources dismantling the cathedrals of our inner lives, our sense of duty, our deep connections, just to use the stones to build an attention-seeking stage.
The result being a population that feels incredibly light, ungrounded, and unstable the moment the network goes dark.
And that instability, that inability to anchor ourselves, it inevitably leaks out of our individual lives and into our shared public life.
Which is a perfect transition, because if the individual is unanchored, floating in this sea of approval and obsessed with performance, it's inevitable that our public spaces, our town halls, are going to suffer a functional failure.
That town hall meeting anecdote from the sources is just a devastating symbol of this decay of public listening and, frankly, emotional intelligence. We really need to look at what happened in that room.
So you had a veteran teacher trying to explain a complex, nuanced school budget issue, a necessary but difficult piece of civic work.
Yeah.
But the audience wasn't really engaging civically.
Not at all. The sources describe a room where the main activity was preparing to broadcast. A huge portion of the audience was filming her, not to document, but to wait for a mistake, a slip-up, a moment of frustration they could clip and post as a gotcha moment.
While the rest of the audience was just checked it.
Completely, just scrolling on their phones, faces lit up by the glow of their screens. The atmosphere was totally devoid of genuine curiosity. It was saturated with this ready-made performative outrage.
And then the Q&A session starts.
And the very first interaction, after this long, complex presentation, it wasn't a question. It was a pre-packaged political slogan shouted explicitly for the benefit of the smartphone that was recording it. It was designed as a soundbite, not a civic contribution.
Which highlights the cognitive failure. The inability to hold a complex thought for longer than a caption. If your goal is to make a viral clip, complexity is the enemy.
And this goes way beyond just bad manners. The sources argue this is a profound functional failure of our shared discourse. It undermines the cognitive foundations of classical liberal engagement and, crucially, institutional trust. If we lose the ability to listen, we stop being a public. We just become, as the sources say, a collection of competing broadcasts.
Just shouting into a void. And this shift, where subjective feelings and performance trump objective reality, it didn't just happen. It's been structurally reinforced by what the sources call the therapeutic state.
This is a critical pivot in the analysis, drawing on thinkers like Thomas Saz and James L. Nolan. The concept of the therapeutic state is key. It's defined as a government that has been systematically infused with a therapeutic ethos.
So this isn't just about mental health policy.
No, it's much bigger. This ethos provides the symbols and codes that determine the boundaries of moral life. It essentially replaces traditional, historically rooted moral codes.
So instead of talking about societal problems in terms of, say, right and wrong or duty, the state encourages us to frame everything as a health problem, a pathology or a trauma that needs treatment.
Precisely. This ethos is characterized by an emotivist ethic. It privileges subjective feeling and emotional distress as the highest form of reality. And the sources argue it's particularly insidious because it doesn't actually challenge the fundamental structures of capitalism or technology. In fact, it's a perfect cultural complement to them.
How so?
Well, when people feel burnt out or alienated or they're facing structural inequality, the therapeutic state individualizes the problem. It's not the system that's flawed, it's your resilience that's the problem. It's your emotional history that requires therapeutic intervention.
It diverts structural critique into personal pathology. So who are the new authorities in this system? Who are the high priests of the therapeutic state?
They establish what's called a new priestly class. The authority moves from traditional priests or moral philosophers to psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, counselors, and crucially, they get their prestige not just because they might help individuals, but because they help the state, which is often who pays them or accredits them.
They become essential functionaries of the state.
Yes, defining the boundaries of acceptable emotional life and diagnosing any deviation from it. And we can see the material evidence of this everywhere, especially in the justice system, which used to deal in objective concepts of law and duty, not subjective feelings.
Right. I mean, you could track the shift in both civil and criminal law. In civil law, there was this huge change in how we treat emotional injury.
A dramatic shift. Historically, if you wanted to sue for emotional injury, it generally had to be tied to a physical injury. That was the parasitic tort rule.
Meaning the emotional distress had to be a parasite on a physical harm.
Correct. The logic was practical. Without a physical anchor, claims for emotional injury were just too hard to verify and too easy to fake. The courts were very suspicious of purely psychological claims.
But that's not the case anymore.
Not since the late 1960s. The sources note that starting around 1968, there was an explosion of successful emotional injury cases. The legal standard moved decisively toward emotional injury gaining independent tort status. The state was now officially validating the idea that your subjective feeling is a reality that other people must compensate you for.
And we see a similar thing on the criminal justice side with the drug court movement.
Yes, this therapeutic approach really took off with programs in the 70s and then accelerated with drug courts in the late 80s. In these courts, the traditional structure of justice kind of collapses. It becomes personalized.
The judges and prosecutors start acting like therapists.
Exactly. The focus shifts entirely to the treatment and recovery of the offender, framed through the lens of their emotional pathology. The crime itself is softened, and the emphasis moved to the offender's underlying issues that need fixing.
So drug use is redefined as a pathology that needs treatment like any other illness.
Right. And the offender is re-educated to explore their feelings or the trauma behind their abuse. And critically, this re-education includes the judges and lawyers who are trained to be more understanding and to redefine what success even means in this system.
So if success is now about treatment and emotional well-being, what happens to the old objective metrics like recidivism rates? Do they still matter?
This is the huge paradox the sources expose. Conventional objective criteria, especially recidivism, the likelihood the person will commit more crimes, are routinely ignored or marginalized or even statistically distorted.
In favor of more subjective criteria.
In favor of subjective metrics focused on the perceived needs and emotional progress of the offenders. The sources are pretty stark here. There is often little reliable empirical evidence that these therapeutic courts actually reduce recidivism any better than the conventional system.
That's a profound indictment. The system is operating on an ethos that it can't objectively prove is working, yet it just keeps expanding.
It expands because the justification shifts. The therapeutic focus on treating the offender's pathology redefines what a utilitarian outcome even is. The goal is no longer strictly public safety, measured by recidivism, but the subjective well-being of the offender as defined by the state's therapeutic class.
So the state is no longer a classical protector of rights, but a moral tutor and a therapist.
That's the argument. And this failure of public listening, this focus on feelings over facts, this expansion of the state into our emotional lives, it's all connected. It shows that institutional trust decays when institutions stop dealing with objective reality and start dealing with curated, subjective emotional needs.
Which brings us to the broader philosophical critique of state power itself. This expansion of the state's function into personal pathology, it raises a fundamental question. What is the proper role of the state?
And this is where our sources, drawing from the classical, liberal, and Austrian school traditions, offer a really powerful counter-ideal, a critique of state expansion.
So let's start with the core principle. What is classical liberalism fundamentally based on?
It's based on the idea that civil society, which they define as the whole social order built on private property and voluntary exchange, is, by and large, self-regulating.
Meaning good things happen without a central plan.
Exactly. Beneficial order emerges naturally from the interactions of individuals. So, historically, this doctrine has been deeply hostile to state action. The state should be reduced to an absolute minimum, provide peace, easy taxation, and a tolerable, objective administration of justice. Everything else, they argue, should be brought about by the natural course of things.
This sounds like a deep belief in spontaneous order, not chaos, but an emergent complexity.
Spontaneous order is the centerpiece of the tradition, championed by thinkers like Menger and Hayek. They argued that our most beneficial institutions, law, language, money, are overwhelmingly the product of the unintended consequences of individual actions, not conscious design.
So can you give an example of that, how something complex emerges without a plan?
Menger's theory on the origin of money is the classic case. No king or committee sat down and said, let's invent money. Instead, you had individuals just trying to make their own lives better who realized that certain goods, like precious metals, were more widely accepted in trade than others.
So it was easier to trade for.
Right. So even if you didn't need gold yourself, it made sense to accept it in a trade because you knew you could easily trade it later for what you did need. That purely self-seeking action repeated millions of times unintentionally created a common medium of exchange money. An institution crucial for modern society, but one that nobody designed.
And that stands in stark contrast to the idea that everything useful has to be designed by someone smart.
It's a direct contrast to what the sources call the Lycurgus myth, which was popular with some Enlightenment thinkers. This is the myth that useful structures have to come from a designing mastermind, a great lawgiver like Lycurgus in Sparta, who literally instituted a people and all their customs.
So if you believe in the Lycurgus myth, you see society as a machine that needs an engineer.
Exactly. And Hayek saw this as incredibly dangerous. He argued that if you believe everything useful was consciously designed, then you'll also believe you have the power to refashion it completely however you want.
Which is the philosophical justification for collectivism and socialism.
Precisely. It's the belief that you can just abolish the market or the law and remake it from scratch. The spontaneous order view is much more humble. It recognizes we rely on institutions whose complexity we only dimly understand.
And yet, even with this understanding of complexity, we know that academic intellectuals often have a deep hostility towards the market. Why is that? Why the anti-capitalist bias?
The sources offer a structural explanation for this, rooted in the social position of the intellectual class. They're often described as mandarins. They're sheltered from the day-to-day rigors of market forces.
Their income is assured. It comes from taxes or endowments, not from pleasing a customer.
Right. They fundamentally fail to internalize the lived reality of an entrepreneur who literally lives and dies by the market. And the sources call this socially determined distorted cognition. It's a cognitive bias that comes from their secure reality.
So they view big business with condescension and mistrust because they have no personal contact with that world, no stake in its success or failure.
And this bias has led to real historical misinterpretations. The sources detail how many historians uncritically accepted the myth that German big business was central to the Nazi rise to power, a myth that served a political narrative but ignored the facts. The intellectual struggles to appreciate the market because they're sheltered from its defining features: risk, accountability, and the suddenness of failure.
This critique, that those shielded from risk struggle to understand wealth creation, is also central to an older classical liberal idea, the liberal class conflict theory.
Yes, this is a fascinating tradition that actually predated Marx. It came out of France, from liberals like Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer, who were called the industrialists. And they had a theory of class conflict that was purely anti-statist.
So they didn't see the conflict as being between the factory owner and the worker, like Marx did. It was about your relationship to the state.
Exactly. They conceptualized class conflict not between groups within the free market, but between two categories of people, defined only by how they get their wealth. They saw two great classes.
And who were they?
First, the producers. They called them the industrious, or the Bs. These are the people who live by production, innovation, voluntary exchange. They create wealth. The second class, the predators, were labeled the idle, the devouring, or the hornets.
And they live by plunder.
They live by plunder, achieved mainly through statist predation, using the state to forcibly take wealth from the producers.
And this is where their critique of government gets really uncompromising. They saw public functionaries, government workers, as part of that predatory class.
Their view was radical. They said that a public functionary, in their role as a functionary, produces absolutely nothing of economic value. They exist only on the products of the industrious class. They consume nothing that hasn't been taken by force through taxation.
Did they use this theory to look at history?
They did. They reinterpreted the French Revolution. They said it wasn't a clash between the oppressed masses and the aristocracy. It was a war to decide who would get to occupy the government jobs and exploit the nation, the old nobles or the rising new class. They argued the revolution's remedy of just replacing one predatory class with another was worse than the original disease.
This theory offers a powerful, if cynical, explanation for why government just keeps expanding beyond any real social need. It's driven by internal pressure.
That's the core of it. The industrialists argued that government expands because more and more people want the guaranteed income and prestige of a government job. And as more people join the state sector, the predatory class two things have to happen. Government power must expand, and the tax burden on the producing class must grow.
So the state has to keep extending its scope into education, health, industry, and now therapy, just to create jobs for all the people who want them.
Exactly. To fulfill that ambition for state employment, the government has to continually create new functions, which transforms the functionaries into a class that is enemy to the well-being of all the others.
It's fascinating how these two critiques, the one about structural narcissism and the one about the classical liberal anti-statism, they really converge here.
The coherence is undeniable, isn't it? Both identify a modern system that prioritizes external performance, whether it's digital visibility or state prestige, over actual difficult vertical work like self-integration or market production. The individual is driven to perform their life for external validation, and the state, in its expanded therapeutic role, validates those external metrics while simultaneously expanding the very class structure that lives off the producers. It's a dual dynamic of externalization.
Externalization of the self and externalization of productive cost.
The journey we've taken today, guided by these really diverse sources, it all traces the profound and often devastating trade-offs of our modern era. We started with that frantic performance of discipline, the woman with her tripod.
And we moved quickly from that to the psychological level, this idea of pathological narcissism being rooted in an internal void, to the structural reality of networked individualism.
We saw how individuals like Clara make that calculated choice to trade vertical self-integration, family, history, deep connection, for these horizontal validation metrics.
A preference for visual ROI over genuine civic labor. And that accelerates structural enemy, dissolving the internal anchors we need for stability.
And then we saw the consequences of that in public life. The decay of listening in that town hall scene, a functional failure that's underpinned by the rise of the therapeutic state.
A state that uses this emotivist ethos to replace traditional moral structures, redefining complex conflicts as just issues of treatable pathology, and often completely disregarding objective measures of success, like recidivism.
And finally, we placed all of that within its deepest philosophical context. The classical liberal insistence on a self-regulating civil society, on spontaneous order, contrasted so sharply with the idea of the predatory state.
A state whose expansion is driven by the internal ambition of its own functionaries, who the industrialists defined as a class that exists only on the product of the industrious.
Ultimately, what all the sources suggest is that the core cost of optimizing our lives for external validation, for the aesthetic performance of discipline or virtue or success, is the quiet, profound disintegration of the internal anchors necessary for both individual self-coherence and a shared civic life.